I'm Soumya Chattopadhyay from second year. Today, we are going to discuss about amino acids, proteins, the classification structures, enzymes, and ribonuclease and its mechanism. And on the later part, I will demonstrate you how to visualize a protein in a 3D way. And I will also give a brief introduction towards the molecular docking. I will do it with the help of ribonuclease. So amino acids and proteins. What does an amino acid consist of? It basically consists of a central carbon atom, which we also call as C alpha, and it consists of an amino group, carboxyl group, and the most important part, it has an R group. Now, R group has its important because whatever the categories in which we will divide the amino acids is based on it. Now, there can be two types of
Shunu,
amino
sorry for
acids.
the interruption. Can you do it in full screen, like in present mode?
Yes.
Yeah, it's okay.
So as I was saying, like it can be two types of amino acids, L amino acids and D amino acids. But most of the cases, L amino acids are incorporated into proteins. Now, amino acids can vary in size, shape, and polarity. First, I will give some examples. These are the two structures of glycine and proline. Why I have given this particular examples because when I was saying like it was C alpha, it's basically a chiral carbon. But in the case of glycine, it's a chiral, and in proline, you can say that it's not an amino acid, it's an amino acid. And why is that so? Because the CH2 and the CH2 you see here bends over itself and forms an amino group, and that's why it has the maximum steric hindrance too. And basically, when we represent an amino acid, it's basically in this Witter ionic form. Here it will be NS3 plus and it will be CO minus. Now, these are hydrophobic amino acids. By the structures, you can say that it has abundance of carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms, means it's bulky, and as the name suggests, hydrophobic, it repels the water. Now, polar amino acids. This have its importance because whatever the N and the O you see, they can form interaction, they can interact with the solvent and can form hydrogen bonds with it. So it can form a network when it's present in a solvent. Now, acidic amino acids. Basically, you can see a relation between the previous slide and this slide. You see aspartic acid and asparagine. There is a relation between them. In asparagine, you see that's a peptide bond. But where does the peptide bond arises from? It arises from a carboxyl group, which you see in aspartic acid. So you can correlate in this way also, like asparagine and here aspartic acid. There you can see glutamine and here it's glutamic acid. There it's the peptide bond and here is the carboxyl group. Now you see the pKa, it's 3.71 and the pKa is 4.15 for glutamic acid. It has its importance too because it said that when the pK is lower than our physiological pH, it generally loses its proton. Whereas you can see in NS3 plus, which has much higher pKa than our physiological pH, it won't lose its proton. But uh, as they have the pKa which is lower than the physiological pH, which is around 7.4, it will lose its proton. Similarly, the basic amino acids, they have pKa more than our physiological pH. But this one is quite interesting. Histidine sometimes is considered as positively charged and sometimes it's also considered as negatively charged. Now we must know why is that so? Because when we classify it in many sites, you can see that histidine is considered as negatively charged. So the reason is that histidine can act as both proton acceptor and proton donor. When it's in the protonated form, it's a weak acid, and when it's in a deprotonated form, it is a Bronsted base. And it has its importance in the enzyme machinery, which I will talk about later in the later slides. And at around 6.7 pH, there is a continuous protonation and the deprotonation, due to which large number of catalytic sites are formed. Aromatic amino acid. Now, it's quite unique, and it's interesting to see that it has a phenomena that it absorbs UV light, and by the virtue of their presence we can find the concentration. Like suppose we have been given a concentration, and of in a protein we have been given a protein, and we need to find the concentration of it. So by using the phenomena of absorption of UV light and the Beer-Hambert's law, we can find the unknown concentration. Basically whatever the readings we take is at 280 nanometer. That's why this A is sometimes written as A280. Now here we use this Beer-Hambert's law formula. A is equal to ECl, where A is the absorbance at 280 nanometer, C is the unknown concentration, length is given to us, and E is the extinction point of a protein, which is specific, and it can also be said as the absorption coefficient. Now, modified amino acids. There are some amino acids which go further modification after the translation. We know about the central dogma. First, from RNA to protein, DNA to RNA, then RNA to protein by translation. But after translation, there are some modifications, and due to those post-translation modifications, there are some modified amino acids. Suppose you have the proline structure. Here you will get just an extra hydroxy part attached to it. Similarly, there are some changes in glutamate. At the gamma position of glutamate, you can see that there is carboxyl group introduced at the gamma position. So it's known as gamma carboxyl gamma carboxy glutamate. These types of modification occurs after the translation. Now, ionization of amino acid. That was the part I was talking in the previous slides too. You have first this kind of a structure, but when it is in a solvent which has the pKa is equal to 2, and abstraction of proton will occur. Like this COH minus, this COH will lose one of its proton. Now when it's transferred to medium where the pKa is equal to 10, which is more than the physiological pH, even now this NS3 plus will lose its electron. So here you see it will lose its proton. Hence there is an abstraction of proton and it forms this structure. That's how you can ionize an amino acid. Now going into the structural aspects, I will talk about how a peptide bond is formed. It is formed when the amino group of an amino acid and the carboxyl group of another amino acid interacts with each other, and there is a dehydration, like there is a removal of water and a peptide bond is formed. Now, if you want to see the protein structure, there is one more covalent bond except the peptide bond which can be formed is the disulfide bonds. It's the only other covalent bond we can find in the protein structure. And the amino acids which are capable of forming the disulfide bonds are cysteine and methionine. They can form some disulfide bonds. Here is another example of the formation of protein bond. Like you can see that OH comes from the glycine part and the H will come from the alanine part, and there is a removal of water and there is a formation of peptide bond. Now I will tell you about how to write a protein sequence. Basically, what is the basic thing you require to write a protein sequence? It's nothing, just the you just need to know what is present in the side chain. If you know what is present in the side chain, you can easily write a protein sequence irrespective of how much is the length of the protein. And we know that every protein is going to start with the N terminal which has the NS3 plus, and it's gonna end with the C terminal which has CO minus. So as soon as we know what is present in the R group, we can use the 1-letter code or the 3-letter code to write a protein sequence. Now I will come to the structural aspects. Now this is one fascinating experiment, to be honest. Like what was done was Afinson is the name of the one who did the experiment, professor. Now what he did was that he took a native ribonuclease, he took an active native structure and added BME, which is beta mercaptoethanol, which acts as a reducing agent, and he furthermore added urea, which unfolds the protein. Now as a result, the protein coil unfolds. Now we get an unfolded ribonuclease. Now you see that there are these black dots. These are nothing but SH. So then we remove the BME and the urea. We give it the full freedom to form the disulfide bonds with any. Like this can form the disulfide bonds with the last one. it can fold into any kind of a structure, it can have any conformation. But the surprising thing is that when we give, even if we give it freedom to form any conformation, it will go back to its actinitic structure. Even if you give any kind of freedom to it, it will stay loyal, and whatever the disulfide bonds, suppose if these were forming the disulfide bonds, even after giving freedom, these two will only form the disulfide bonds and it will go back to its native structure. It's quite fascinating thing, and even till now there is no there is no concrete reason for that. Now, protein structure, there are some physical properties which influence the stability and with which we can determine how it's gonna fold. First is the rigidity of the backbone, which is basically the primary structure, like which is the main amino acid sequence, and then amino acid interaction with the H2O. Now, as I said in the previous slides, the one who can form the interaction with the H2O are the polar amino acids. So polar amino acids are the only one who can form the interaction with the H2O. And then there comes the hydropathy index, with which we can know whether the residue is hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Now, why is that important even? That's important because we get to know the relative positioning of the residues. If we know is the hydrophilic, it will try to be on the outer side and try to form bonds with the solvent. But if it's like hydrophobic, it will try to be in the main core. Now there can be interactions among the amino acids. First one is electrostatic interaction, hydrogen bonds, which can be between the polar amino acid and the solvent. Then there can be the disulfide bonds by the cysteine and methionine, and there can be the volume constants. And by volume constants, I mean the steric hindrances and the size and the shape of the side chain group. Now, conformation. Basically, we know that there can be two types of conformation, cis and trans. But before that, I will try to tell you about what are the torsion angles in a protein. When a protein is formed, what are the various torsion angles it can form? Because later on, we are going to study about the Ramachandran plot. Now, it's the phi you see here. It's basically the angle between the NCA and why. Don't think why I'm saying Ca, because Ca is usually the short form of the alpha carbon. So the phi is basically the angle between NCA, and the psi is the angle between the C and the C bond, and this omega is the angle of the peptide bond. Now, what is the speciality of this peptide bond is that it has partial double bond character. And what does the partial double bond character do? It gives rigidity to the molecule. It won't allow rotation above the peptide bond. As I said, there can be two types of conformation, cis and trans, but cis amino acids are quite rare. Like they are quite rare because we can understand that when they will be in the cis position, they can cause the steric hindrances. Now we will try to predict the geometry of a protein molecule. Now I will go step by step why these are the three basic things which we require. Suppose I give you to predict the geometry of H2 molecule. For that, you just need to know what is the distance between those two hydrogen molecule. But if I say you to just with the bond length, can you decide the geometry of a water molecule? You can't, because even if I tell you what is the distance between O and H, then again other O and H, you can't decide it because you don't know the angle. So bond angle is required, and when there are more than three or even more bigger molecules, you might need the dihedral angle, which you can see like when you open a copy in half side, you can see there are two planes, and the angle between them you can consider it as the dihedral angle, the angle between the two planes. Now the Ramachandran plot, it's quite important. Like it's a must for every protein structure. If you want to make a protein structure, it has to fit in this Ramachandran plot. And it's a thing which we should be quite proud of, because it was found by G.N. Ramachandran. What he did was that whatever I was talking about, this phi and the psi, he plotted the phi and the psi on a graph, and after plotting, he got these kind of structures which tell you which conformation is more stable and which is not. Now, if you see the graph, the red regions are the ones which are the most stable ones. Like if it's a right-handed alpha helix, then it lies in this red region. It will be the most stable one. And even if it's a beta sheet, the ones in this red region will be the most special one, like it will be the most special stable one, as there will be less steric hindrances. Now in yellow regions there can be some more interactions, like such like small van der Waal interaction, and it will be less stable than the red ones. Now there are some amino acids which try to break this plot, such as the proline. It is so rigid that it doesn't try to fit in any of this graph. And there are some amino acids which like fit in every of this plotting. Like if you say about glycine, it can fit in any of this graph. Hence, if you want to create a protein structure, you need to have that in the Ramachandran plot. Now I will come about the structures like the primary, secondary, and tertiary and quaternary structures. So the primary structure is nothing but the sequence in which amino acids are arranged in the polypeptide chain. Like it is the main framework of a protein. And everything that the primary structure is again going to start with the N terminal, which has the NH3 plus, and it's going to end with the C terminal, which has the CO minus. And the distance between the two peptide bonds is 0.35 nanometer. Now comes the secondary structure. Now, if you have the linear big sequence, the main structure, but when they form a steric relationship, like even these long structures have a new kind of a relationship, those are the secondary structures. They give the periodicity to the structures, and there are three types of it. Mainly the two types: helices and the beta pleated sheets. And Ramachandran also found about the collagen helix. Basically, in the alpha helix, we see that there are two two strands which coil around each other. But there's a special case in collagen helix. It has three of the strands which coil around each other and are strengthened by the hydrogen bonds. Now I will talk about alpha helix, the most common helix we talk about. It's coiled spirally in right-handed manner. It doesn't mean that it can't be in the left-handed manner, but left-handed manner is quite rare. Now, as you see, these bonds are stabilized by the interaction between the oxygen of the carboxyl group and the hydrogen of the amino group. These have this interaction and they stabilize this coil. Now, the important things that we need to remember when we are talking about the alpha helix is that it's going to be right-handed. It has the spatial parameter. And why is the spatial parameter required? Because it has to be in the Ramachandran plot. So we have to remember its phi and the psi. Then n is equal to 3.6. That means that there are 3.6 residues per turn, and it has a pitch of 0.5 nanometer. Now we usually talk about the alpha helix, but alpha helix is not the type of helix. There are different types of helices. Now, how do we classify them? Like if it's alpha helix, 310 helix, what's the difference between them? And it's the pi helix, what's the difference between them? Suppose you have an ith residue here, and the when we talk about the alpha helix, let this be the I plus fourth residue. Then there is a hydrogen bond formed between them. Then only we say that it's an alpha helix when there is a hydrogen bond between the ith residue and the I plus fourth residue. Similarly, 310 helices means it has three residues and 10 atoms in it. Like in 3 turns, it has 10 atoms, so it's known as 310 helix. But the main thing is that from the ith to the I plus 3 term, it forms a hydrogen bond. And in this pi helices, you can see that there is a hydrogen bond formed later on with the ith residue and the I plus fifth residue. Sorry. Now, while going from 310 to the pi helix, what difference is that the diameter enlarges. Now, another type of the second structure which we usually talk about is the beta sheets. Now, there can be two types of beta sheets. One is parallel beta sheet and another is anti-parallel beta sheet. The examples of beta sheets are keratin and fibroin. In keratin, there are parallel beta sheets, which means that the hydrogen bonds will be formed between the two same amino acids. And when it's anti-parallel, the hydrogen bonds are going to be formed between two different amino acids. And usually, this beta sheets are quite more extended than the alpha helices. Now comes the tertiary structure. After the formation of secondary structure, we can form all more types of different they can have more interactions between them, such as you can see in the structure there can be hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interaction, disulfide bonds by cysteine and methionine, and they can be even ionic bonds. So when they are formed, it gives a 3D structure to it. Like if you want to know the 3D structures, you have to see the tertiary structure, where it gives the total overall structure of a protein. And to remain in this tertiary structure, there is an essential protein which is required, which is known as chaperone. Now the quaternary structures. These are the structures which are found in the multimeric protein, and each peptide has its own tertiary structure and it functions as a subunit of protein. But there are so many polypeptides that work together and they form a quaternary structure. They fit back together and they give the quaternary structure. Like for example, hemoglobin, insulin is also there because it has two polypeptide chain. Hemoglobin I am saying because it has four polypeptide chains, 2 alpha, 2 beta. This is the structure I got through the PyMol. This is not the best of the structure, but I will demonstrate it later. The four different chains, you can see it through the PyMol. But before that, you can see that these are the four polypeptide chains, so it gives a quaternary structure. Now I will talk about the enzymes. Enzymes are the protein catalyst. They work as a catalyst and they alter the rate of chemical reaction. Either they are going to increase it or decrease it. But itself, it's not going to change. It's not going to change its number. It's not going to change its shape. It's not going to change. It's going to remain the same, but it's going to change the rate of reaction. Now I will explain these two diagrams. This is basically the energy profile of a reaction, the most common reactions we have. Let's suppose it be A plus B, then let it be C plus D. So this delta G is the energy difference between the it is the energy difference between the production of product and the reactant we had. And this delta G, you can see that there is a dagger like structure. So this delta G is also known as the energy of activation, the minimum energy required to facilitate the reaction to move forward. Now what does the enzymes do? It catalyzes the reaction. It has nothing to do with the delta G. You should never mess that the catalyst is going to change its delta G or not. It's not going to change delta G because it's completely a thermodynamic quantity, and um, enzymes has nothing to do with this thermodynamic quantities, and it's totally kinetic. Whatever the effect it's going to bring is kinetic. So what this enzyme does, that it reduces the activation of energy. The energy which you require so that the reaction can move forward gets lower. It makes sure that the equilibrium point is reached in a faster terms. Like it's not going to change the equilibrium point, it's just going to change the fact that it will reach the equilibrium point faster. Now I will talk about the enzyme active sites. What are the enzyme active sites? These are the sites where basically the enzyme binds to the substrate. Like there's a substrate like this comes and binds to the enzyme on specific location where it has the active sites. Now the active sites has several important properties, like it has charge, pKa. PKa is again, it tells us whether it's deprotonated, it's protonated, or it's in the zwitterionic ionic form. So with pKa we can predict that. And hydrophobicity, again we can use the hydropathic scales, and we can also tell it we can tell the relative positioning through the hydrophobicity. Now what happens is that there is an enzyme, a substrate comes and it reacts with the active site. Now suppose in this position there is an electrostatic interaction, it has an hydrophobic site, then in the active site it also must have the hydrophobic site, it also must have the electrostatic sites, then only they are gonna combine. Now the properties of enzyme, they are basically they are proteinaceous in nature, and enzymes are not going to start a reaction, it's just going to change the rate of reaction. It leads to the higher turnover numbers, which increases the efficiency. It's not going to change. It has specificity, like Every enzyme has a specific substrate. It's gonna react with that only. Now, enzyme classifications. We are going to classify enzymes. There can be two types of enzymes: simple enzymes and complex enzymes.
Shomo, hello.
Yes, sir.
Sorry
Yes,
for
sir.
interrupting. Yeah, just sorry for interrupting. Like, would you? I just forgot to ask you at the beginning. Would you like to take the questions in between the slides, or would you like to take all the questions at the end?
Yes, sir. If the you can they can ask the questions in between the slides too. Like if they find that something is unusual in the slide, they can ask about it right away.
Okay, okay. Then in that case, I'll just interrupt you shortly and ask the questions. Okay. So, for
Yes, sir.
example, Akash here is asking, can you please elaborate reaction coordinate again? He says he's not able to catch it. See if you could elaborate on reaction coordinate.
This one,
Is it that one, Akash?
Akash, you can unmute your mic and ask your questions too.
Yes. One minute. Let me see if it is in there. Okay, I think. Oh yes, Akash is in there. Hello, Akash. You can unmute yourself.
Yeah, my question is, can you please elaborate the reaction coordinate part again?
Acha, the reaction coordinate part. So see, like there we have a reactant. Suppose it's we have the reactant A, or you can assume that it's A plus B. Then we have uh, a specific amount of energy we require to make the reaction go forward. That it's known as the energy of activation. Is the activation energy we need to make the reaction go forward. And after it crosses that barrier of activation energy, it reaches the endpoint where the product is formed. Now the delta G naught you see here is the energy difference between at the initial what energy was there when there was reactant and what is the energy which will be left after the formation of product, and that energy difference that gives free energy is the delta G naught you see here. And this delta G naught dagger is the energy of activation. Now, what the enzyme does that it reduces this delta G dash, delta G dagger, whatever you say, it's just gonna decrease the energy of activation. It's it will not change this delta G naught. It will remain the same. It's just gonna decrease this delta G dagger. As I said, that whatever the enzyme does is totally kinetic aspect. You can't link it with the thermodynamic aspect, and it can't change the delta G. I hope I could clear your doubt, Akash.
Yeah, got it. You can continue.
Okay, and so could you quickly just do one thing? Just
Yes, sir.
stop, reshare the screen, stop sharing, and then again start the sharing. I think in between, someone started screen sharing, and I guess for some people, your sharing got away from the main presentation.
Okay, the
So that would be great if you do that. Mm.
I guess my screen is visible now.
Yes, your screen
Yes,
is
yes.
visible.
So, where is the
Yeah.
point if someone missed some slides from where they missed if they want to ask?
Yes,
If there
I
is,
guess we can take some questions right now.
if someone missed slides, you can tell that I will reshare the slide again.
No, no, I think this was the slide you were talking actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Also, the
Yeah,
next slide also, you just backed from this the slide number 30 to slide number 29.
yeah, I guess for me it was visible, but maybe for people who were joining via the mobile, it was not visible properly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So, I will talk about this again. Then there comes an enzyme, and there is a substrate, and these are the active sites where um, the residues are there. And as I said, that they must be of the same interaction. Suppose here it has electrostatic residues, like which tends to form electrostatic bonds, then here also in the enzyme part, that must be the same. Like it also has to be of the residues which tends to form electrostatic bonds. I think I was here. So there can be two types of enzymes: simple enzyme and complex enzymes. In simple enzymes, it's totally composed of the proteins, but in complex enzyme, it has both the proteinaceous part and it has small organic molecule. It can be either prosthetic group or coenzyme. Now, what's the difference between a prosthetic group and coenzyme? Basically, when the small organic molecule is bound to the proteinaceous part, that is apoenzyme, by a covalent bond, it is the prosthetic group, and when it's bonded by a non-covalent bond, it's the coenzyme. Now these are the classification of enzymes. It can be classified by oxidoreductase, transferase, hydrolase, lyase, isomerase, and ligase. I'm not going much into the details about it, and they have their examples too. I will go with the enzyme kinetics at first. Firstly, you have an enzyme and it has a substrate. It reaches near the enzyme and it binds with it. While binding, what happens is that the residues break the bond of the substrate. Like there changes in the substrate, and this substrate is no more the substrate and it changes into protein. Then the enzyme releases the protein and it's free again to bind with another substrate. So here you can see that the enzyme is never going to change. It will not go less in number. It will remain the same. The substrate will be changed into protein. Sorry, the product, and it will be released out. Now there are some more mathematical aspects of it. I'm not going much into it, but even if if you want to know the rate of the formation of the product, you can say it as K2 into concentration of ES. Now there can be also the formation. You can also ask about the rate of decomposition of this ES. Now to find out the rate of decomposition of ES, what are the things that is going to decompose it? Either it's going to go back to the E plus S, or it can go to the E plus P. So to find out the rate of this decomposition, we can add K minus 1 into the concentration of E plus S plus the K2 into the concentration of E plus P. So that's how you can also do the mathematical aspects. You can find the velocity, to which I will talk about in this picture. Like at some concentration Km, it attains a velocity which is half of the maximum velocity. So these are the things which you can find when you apply mathematics to it. Now coming to this picture, if I explain it, what will happen if you increase the amount of substrate? Like if you have a sufficient amount of substrate, but you give it even more, for some time you will find that there is an increase in rate of like higher turnover number you will find it. But after some time you will realize that there's no more increase in the rate. Why is that? So because every amino acid which was there, every active site has already been saturated, every active site has been taken. At that time it's said to be have attained maximum velocity. It can no more, even if you give more substrate, it will not change and it will be stagnant. So if you increase the rate, if you increase the substrate, it's going to increase for some time and then it's going to attain its maximum velocity and stop. Now the effect of temperature and the pH on the enzymatic activity, it's kind of similar. Like every enzyme has its optimum temperature and the optimum pH. At that exact optimum temperature and pH, it's going to act the best. But if you go overboard with it, it's going to decrease the rate of reaction. Like if you heat it more than expected, then the enzyme will be denatured, and once it's denatured, you can't get to its enzymatic activity again. Similar case in the optimum pH, it's going to act the best in the optimal pH. If it's low or less, it's going to decrease its activity. Basically what happens when you increase the temperature by a lot is that the molecules that gain kinetic energy get so powerful that they break the hydrogen bonds which are present, and that results in the denaturation, that the structures get broken. That's why the denaturation occurs when you heat it quite a lot. Now, the enzyme substrate complex, which I was talking about, there are two types in which it can happen. First mechanism is the lock and key model, and the second is induced fit. To say about the lock and key model, I will just give an example. As the name suggests, suppose there is a lock, and each lock has its specific key. Without the specific key, you can't open the lock. And in the similar way, the shape of the enzyme will not change. So the shape of the substrate has to be specific. A specific substrate is gonna fit into the lock. That is the enzyme. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt again. So would you like to take another question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So Sravundi, these asking, you mentioned about turnover. So can you
Yes.
explain parameters defining turnover?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Turnover means what is the whatever the substrate you are having, it is the conversion um it is the conversion of substrate into the product or any else structure per minute. That number is known as the turnover number. Like the amount of the substrate which is getting changed into this product form or any other transition structure per minute is known as the turnover number.
Yeah. Soumya,
Yeah.
I know about that. Mean the substrate is converting. That is the turnover, but there are many parameters. I mean, you need to tell those things because this turnover is a very important thing regarding the enzymes. You must
Yes.
not know it now because you are very at the early stage. So this turnover, there are many parameters of mean velocity of the enzyme and will amount of substrate is also mean there are many factors which are actually controlling this turnover, and that is very important thing you must know about it. That I was telling you must look into it after
Okay.
giving this presentation. It
Yes,
is a
Deep, for
very
sure.
important thing.
Yes, Deep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Deep. Now, the next topic we will talk about is the enzyme inhibition. There are certain inhibitors which inhibit the enzymatic property. Um, they can decrease the binding of the substrate, and basically most of the drugs are the enzyme inhibitors. And the best example for it can be the antibiotics which we use. The antibiotics which we use inhibit the enzymatic activity of which inhibits the enzyme of the bacteria by affecting its bacterial metabolism. On the last slide, I will be talking about the ribonuclease mechanism. Like it's an example. There can be different types of enzymes, and they can have different types of machineries. But I will be talking about ribonuclease enzyme. Now, this is quite a fascinating mechanism because the histidine you see here and the histidine you see here, at first step they are gonna do a specific work, and in the very next step they are gonna interchange their role. So basically, we are taking this is the structure of RNA, and as the name suggests, this is going to cleave the RNA. The ribonuclease functions by cleaving the RNA. Now, how it happens? Even in the histidine, there are some histidines which are catalytic, such as histidine 12 and histidine 119. Now, first step which happens is that the cyclization step. Here, the histidine 12 acts as the base, and the histidine 119 is going to act as the acid. What happens is that from the 2-OH of the RNA, this histidine 12 is going to abstract a proton, like it's going to abstract this CH. Now, what's left is that CHO, and this is going to attack this phosphate group, which results into a cyclic intermediate phosphate structure. And in the meanwhile, this NH group uh, gives its proton, and it acts as an acid. Like it gives its proton to this, and there is a cleavage in the RNA. It cleaves the bond by giving the H to this O, and then the bonds is cleaves. But in the very next step, what happens is that the histidine 119 now tries to abstract the proton from the water. We give the water, and it abstracts the water. It abstracts the proton from that water. Now, what is left is this OH minus, which is going to attack this cyclic intermediate which was formed earlier. And during that, this H will give its proton back to this OH, and it will now act like an acid. You see that the roles are completely reversed. First in histidine 12 and histidine 19, histidine 12 was acting as uh, histidine 12 was acting as a base, and histidine 119 was acting as an acid. But in the very next step, they have reversed the role, and that's how a ribonuclease cleaves the RNA. And that was all about the uh, PPT I had. Now I will go for the demonstration, like the how you can do a 3D visualization of the protein using PyMon, and later I will also tell about the docking. Any questions for in what you had in the slides? I guess no.
I see that Aritra had some question maybe. Aritra, you can just unmute yourself and ask this question specifically.
Soma, when you were
Yes.
demonstrating the enzyme, then you
Yes,
told
yes.
that the pH influenced the activity of enzyme. Can you say again about
Yes,
that?
yes. Yeah, I will talk about it again. On the custom slide. Yeah. See, and every enzyme has an optimal pH in which it's gonna act the best. So you have to get the enzyme in the correct pH so that it can work. It can work well. Uh, if it's less than the pH, then the optimal pH, the rate of reaction will decrease. If it's more than the pH, then again the rate of reaction will decrease, because enzyme machineries are very sensitive to the pH. Like changing the pH of the surrounding will change the shape of its active site. So that's how the pH also affects.
I think, Aritra, does this answer your question, or was your question that why does the pH actually change the surrounding site?
Yes, yes.
By changing the pH, it will basically affect the charges on the amino acid. So if there's a change in the charges, it also affects the enzyme machinery, and that's why it's gonna if it's not the optimal pH, if it's not the optimal charge on the amino acid molecule, then it's not gonna function well, and that's why it hampers the enzyme machinery.
Okay, thanks for this information.
My most pleasure.
Okay, so thank you so much for this wonderful talk.